Namaskar. Namaskar and very good morning. On the behalf of Azad Hind Fauj Shriti Mahavidyalaya, Domjur, Howrah, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us this morning. Our college is organizing a special invited lecture to celebrate International Museum Day. Today, our college is celebrating International Museum Day 2023, and our theme is the theme of International Museum Day 2023: Objective and Sustainability and Well-being. The objective of International Museum Day is to arise about the fact that museums are important means of cultural heritage, enrichment of culture, development of mutual understanding, cooperation, peace among people. Now, I would like to begin the event, and I would now request our coordinator of IQAC, Dr. Aditi Sengupta, Associate Professor, Department of English, to kindly address her to deliver her welcome address. Madam.
Hello, শোনা যাচ্ছে?
Hi, madam.
Okay. Good morning. Today we have gathered here online to celebrate International Museum Day on behalf of Azad Hind Fauj Shriti Mahavidyalaya, Domjur, Howrah. I welcome Dr. Madhuparna Roychowdhury, Associate Professor, University of Calcutta, our honored guest today, who has taken time out of her busy schedule to deliver a lecture on exploring the multi-dimensional museum movement in India, the colonial perspective. I also extend my warm greetings to all the participants from different colleges and universities across India. Today's special lecture is very important to us, that is the students and staff of this college, for we have just completed a series of study tours in Kolkata, in and around Kolkata, I should say, which includes, among other places, the Indian Museum, the Vivekananda Museum, that is the ancestral house of Swami Vivekananda, which has been transformed into a museum, and Acharya Jagadish Chandra Bose Science Museum, that is also the ancestral house of AJC Bose, again, which has been transformed into a museum. So without further delay, I invite Dr. Roychowdhury once more and request Kaushik to start the proceedings.
Thank you, madam. Our honored guest, Dr. Madhuparna Roychowdhury, Associate Professor, University of Calcutta, was awarded PhD degree on her thesis displaying India's heritage, imperialism, nationalism, and museum movement in colonial Bengal in 2010 by Department of History, University of Calcutta. She received S.R. Das Memorial Prize awarded by the Indian History Congress in 2010 as the best paper in archaeology for the presentation on historical consciousness on museum making in local context, Bengal in early 20th century. She has also received the Charles Wallace India's Trust Fellowship for 2017 and 18. At present, she is working as one of the coordinators in the UPE project phase 2 of the Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, Calcutta University, on early India's interaction with early South Asia, reinterpretation the old and opening up new vistas. She has taken a part of in past research project as History and Culture in Modern India, sponsored by Maulana Abul Kalam Azad Institute for Asian Studies, and UPE project on constituting religious process, goddess of worship in West Bengal and Odisha. Her research interest as social history of India, especially the social history of religion, religious art in ancient and early medieval India, and also literature in history, especially the use of ancient literary accounts, including the epics and Purans, in the reconstruction of ancient Indian history. Her area of research specialization is heritage studies, especially the cultural and intellectual reconstruction of ancient heritage in India through the historical text and archaeological museum. May I now request Dr. Madhuparna Roychowdhury to deliver her lecture.
Thank you very much,
Hello, madam.
Kaushik. Thank you. Can you hear me? Shona jaচ্ছে আমায়?
হ্যাঁ madam, শোনা। হ্যাঁ।
A very good afternoon, everyone. And I'm really thankful to the organizers of the Azadin Fauj Sriti Mahavidyalaya, Dr. Shengupta, our student Kaushik Ghosh, for giving me the opportunity to share some of my research findings with you all today on the very special day of the International Museum Day with you all. I have titled, as Dr. Shengupta had already mentioned, the title of today's talk is Exploring the Multidimensional Museum Movement in India, the Colonial Perspective. Now, we are all aware of the fact that the International Council of Museums, which is popularly known as ICOM, it observes a specific day of the year as the Museum Day, International Museum Day. Now, it began in 1977. From 1977, they started, the practice of observing May 18 as a special day, that is International Museum Day. Now, the question is, what was the objective? Why did they think of choosing a specific day in the year for observing this kind of an International Museum Day? The objective, let me just give you some idea about the objective. The objective for choosing a specific day for such celebration was to create an awareness among the common people across the world about the extremely important role played by a museum in public culture. So it was nothing but to create an awareness among the people that how important the museum is to the common people. Now, the observance of the International Museum Day with a specific theme, it started in the year 1992. Now, even though this year ICOM has the theme as museums, sustainability, and well-being, but before I come to the question of sustainability or museum or the journey of the museums in India, particularly in the colonial period India, I would like to say a few words on the term inclusivity. The term inclusivity is something which characterizes a modern museum. It's a very integral feature of a museum. So what is inclusivity? How do we associate inclusivity with the museum in an indelible manner? I think that is important for everyone, whoever deals with the question of museums. By inclusivity, what we mean is that the museum culture tries to draw a considerable section of the society within its precincts. This considerable section includes the connoisseurs, as well as the semi-literate section of the society, differently abled categories. So by drawing different classes of people, it is not only scholars, it is not only academicians, it is not only connoisseurs. We know when we visit museums, as Dr. Shengupta had just mentioned, that she had taken her students to multiple museums just in the last month or in the recent past. The students they are aware of the fact that in a museum there are a wide section of the people who are not specialists, who are common people. They in a large extent, they are not aware of the niceties of art. They are not aware of the educational or academic part of it, of the discipline, but they go to the museum. So the museums always have this objective of drawing different classes of people within its precincts, because by this it helps the museum functionaries to fulfill a vital social role of fostering inclusivity. So inclusivity is an important factor which is there in the mind of the museum makers or the functionaries. So the museums, by emerging as a cultural space, it provides a common platform to the varied sections of the society. So it is not selective. It is not that only some privileged people are going there. No, not that. So it is giving us a common platform. Different sections of the society, they visit museum every day. It's the goal perhaps is different. For some people it is gaining knowledge, for some people it is just the wonder house or the jadughar. But the museums, by keeping the space open to the wide sections of the society, they perform an important social necessity. Let me tell you, though I told you that it was from 1977 that ICOM started observing a special day for as the International Museum Day. But when I started working on the history of museums, I found that even in the very early days of the foundation of ICOM, when ICOM was founded, in the very first year and the second year, when they defined the term museum, then also they mentioned that the importance of public. So in the very early time, in the inception years, ICOM had been, they knew that without public participation, a museum cannot emerge as a social institution. So when they defined a museum, they used a certain words which I'm reading out: a permanent establishment administered in the public interest with a view to conserve, study, exploit by various means, and basically to exhibit for the pleasure and education of the public objects of cultural value. Look at the definition. If ICOM is using the term pleasure and education of the public, it is for the pleasure and the education of the public. They are displaying objects of cultural value. So here only we can get the term that they have used this year in 2023, that is well-being. You can see the theme includes the word well-being. So well-being, sustainability, all these words were there in the very initial definition that they had provided in the for a museum. So they emphasize the word education, they emphasize the word pleasure, and the utility of the objects or the artifacts to evoke the pleasure and to educate the common people. Just for my students, this is for my students who are here. Where do we get the term museum for the first time? We basically associate the term museum with some Greek words and Latin words, like the Greek words mosa or muse or mosion, where we find some connection with museum. But let us remember one thing, that in the initial period, when the term muses, seat of muses or shrine of muses, this was the meaning of the term mosa or muse. Muse, in Greek mythology, muses they are the patron divinities of the arts. So when an institution or a museum-like institution, the prototype of a museum, when it carried the meaning of the shrine of muses, and I've already told you that muses were the patron divinities of the arts, we can understand that there was an academic role of museums, which was meant in the very original or in the earliest use of the term, of a similar term, musea or mosia. In the Latin word musea, that also meant a library or a study. Now, the first museum, though not in the way we see museums today, not with so much of public participation, the importance of public sphere is very important, a significant part of it. But the earliest conception of a museum is found from a place called Alexandria in Egypt, where we find 4th, 3rd century BCE, Ptolemy I Soter and his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus, they had started an institution with the name of Mosion. This was, for the first time they were using the term Mosion. However, we have to remember that unlike the modern museum, the Mosion at Alexandria did not display works of art. The way we see museums, we go there and we see different kinds of art objects or sculptures exhibited there. The Alexandria Mosion did not have any such depiction. It only remained an institution of learning. Thus, the word museum, the literal meaning of which is the house of muses, conveys the imagery of an institution where the wise men gave instruction to their disciples, which gradually came to be applied to the Greek academicians also. In the original Greek context, it meant a kind of an academy of Plato or Aristotle, where a group of very limited disciples came to get knowledge from their teachers. So you can understand that, like universities, like libraries, the museums, in its very original meaning, it had a very close academic part of it. So it emphasized connection between knowledge and the public consumption of the knowledge. However, even though we are using the term public for the academies in the Greek context and even in the Latin context, we have to remember that the public that these Greek and Latin academies used to cater to, that was not the kind of public that figures in the modern sense. So, so there is a difference. It was a limited group of people. Now it is a very large group of people. And in the Greek context, it was a curious group of young students who used to assemble there. Now we know, as I've told you, it is not only scholars, not only researchers, a very wide section of the people assemble, go to the museums for their entertainment. So now the question is then, when was the time when the museum as a collection house, because we have tried to explain that in the Greek and the Egyptian context, it was not a collection house. It was nothing but an academic institution. Then the question comes, very logical question, then when did the museum as a collection house or as a storehouse of artifacts begin its journey? When did it start? We can associate the emergence of museum as a storehouse of artifacts from the Renaissance period. During the Renaissance time, we find princes, wealthy merchants, they were going in for voyages to different places. Then they were taking things from the colonial world, and the kind of antiquities that they're building in their own houses, that actually developed into a collection. The chambers in their own house that they used for keeping the artifacts were known as studiolo. Now, the studiolo, where the artifacts were kept, sometimes because of the want of space, sometimes artifacts poured in and they developed want of space, lack of space. So when the studiolo was not enough for keeping the artifacts, they developed an underground room which was known as grota, which was beneath the studiolo to keep the artifacts. Now, a typical studiolo, where you have to remember one thing, that the studiolo was not like a modern museum. It was a precursor of a museum, we can say. There are some comparabilities, but this is not a modern museum. Because when we enter a modern museum, suppose just if I give you the example of Indian Museum, which is a very prominent example for us, we find different galleries. Separate galleries are kept for exhibiting specialized objects. Even if we don't give the example of a celebrated museum like the Indian Museum, even if we go to very small museums, local museum, there also we find separate almirahs or cupboards being kept for exhibiting separate artifacts. So one thing strikes us when we go to a small museum or a big museum, that there is a classification. There is a neat arrangement. At least the effort to arrange the things neatly in a classified manner characterizes a modern museum. Then what was the look of the studiolo? How was it designed? We have to remember that the studiolo wore a disorderly look. There was no order. Why was there no order? Because the antiquities of varied character, they were huddled up at a place. Everything was put together. There was no categorization. There was no, arrangement. So there was no arrangement like the modern museums. From what time can we find the museums following a very specific principle of classification? So when did the classification start? We can associate it with the arrival of modern science. With the arrival of modern science, what happened? We know that in modern science there is an emphasis on classification. So we find with the arrival of modern science, there was an attempt to, arrange the motley collection of antiquities in an order. So methods of scientific classification became relevant for the display of artifacts. So the modern museums, the kind of scientific classification, very orderly classification, we can connect it with the contribution of modern science left to the museum world on the mind of the museum makers. Now, the collectors during the Renaissance period, there are many collectors, but I have named here 4 of them who developed a very handsome collection, a very adequate collection in their studiolo. One is Giulio Camillo, then the Venetian collector Giulio Camillo, then the Bolognese naturalist Ulysses Aldrovandi. There was a Duke Albert V of Bavaria, then Samuel Quichberg. They were there among the collectors. However, uh, we have to keep on emphasizing on the fact that this studiolo, this grota, or the earlier Egyptian and the Greek academies, these were not comparable to the modern museums, because the public that the modern museum tries to cater, that is, a large body of people. I have told this, I've already mentioned this point, but it is important for me to stick to this point in order to emphasize the point of inclusivity. Who visited, the common people visited as a house of wonder, and the public responsibilities of a museum curator inevitably take us to the domain of visitors. Now, so we have to remember that the Renaissance collections, which are known as studiolo or grota, whatever be the nomenclature for that, these were not open to the common public. These were all elitist in look. So the Renaissance collections cannot be considered as museums, because for any collection to grow into the concept of a modern museum, the entry to the common people is the main criteria. So we find that it was not before the 19th century that we find that the restricted access to the common people was obliterated. The collection was made open to the public. So this is very important, that we cannot find the open access to the common people in the museums before the middle of the 19th century. But this is not, or we can say the late part of the 18th century with regard to France. I'll give you two examples, one from Britain, the other from France, to show you how the museums gradually changed its character, and it became, from the Renaissance period when it was a kind of a closed access, now it became open access. Before I come to the question of the British and the French museum, let me give you the name of one very, very illustrated museum specialist whose name is Tony Bennett. Tony Bennett, in 1995, he had a very remarkable book written. The name of the book is The Birth of the Museum, History, Theory, Politics. There also, he talks of the involvement of the public and the nation, which contributed to a major transformation in museum practices. So we were trying to emphasize the fact that the relationship, the close relationship between the common people, the public, and the museums and the nation, I mean, common people and the nation, led to a great change in the character of the museum. With the greater democratization of British and French society, and with the development of a mass culture in the course of the 19th century, we find that the character of the British Museum and the Louvre in Paris, they changed. How did it change? Let me give you one example from the British Museum. In tune with the liberal political culture in Britain, by an act of the Parliament, the famous Hans Sloane collection turned into the nucleus of the British Museum around the middle of the 18th century. And entry to the British Museum no longer remained restricted. And with regard to the Louvre Museum in France, this example is very striking. Why? Because the transformation of the Louvre was the most influential and significant event, when from being a restricted royal place, it became accessible to the citizens of the revolution. Once the revolutionary government nationalized the royal art collection and turned it into a public institution in 1793. So with regard to Britain, with British Museum, with regard to the Louvre Museum, both of these are, extremely famous museums of the world. So we find that they were not having open access before a certain time. With regard to Louvre, you can see that it is from 1793. The royal art collection was nationalized and common people also had free access to it. So when someone is asked to carry on a research on museums or write a book on museum, the way I had to do as a part of my research work, one very important or difficult question that someone poses is with the way a museum impacts the common people's mind. So we are not in a position to know the impact that the museum perhaps had on the mind of the common people, on the mind of the visitors. To write a history of how museum visitors were enriched by the galleries and the display boxes is a difficult task. Just look at ourselves. When we go to the museum, we all associate ourselves, we are associated with the academic world, but still we do not often leave a comment in the registry book. We don't leave a comment. Most of the time, we forget to leave a comment at the register. So, because of the lack of sources, because of the lack of such entries, the comments of the common people, I mean, at least those who are associated with the academic world or those who can leave their comments properly, who can write, so they can at least write something in the registry book in order to help future researchers to have an idea about the probable impact that the museum display had left on the mind of the common people, on the visitors. So it is important to recognize again that the modern public sphere made on museums visitors, as I told you, it is semi-literate public, small number of connoisseurs. So it is not enough to study museum as a elevated house of muses. We have to try to grasp the mind of the common people as well, the semi-literate or the illiterate people who often visit it as a curiosity shop, evoking wonders through their carefully crafted objects. Now, one important, a theme that has been kept in this year's International Museum Day theme is sustainability, or we can say sustainable development goals. So inclusivity is important, well-being is important. Apart from that, the keyword in the 2023 Museum Day theme is sustainable development goals. What is sustainable development goal? What is the meaning of it? We have to remember, before I explain it in a brief way, that sustainable development goal that also forms an extremely important concern for the museum makers, for the museum functionaries, and the discussion that I've already started with you by continuously trying to give importance to the role of the public sphere. That is also in a way connected with this particular word sustainability as kept in this year's Museum Day theme. Now, the museums, if you look at the activities of the museum, particularly I am blessed to be connected with the Indian Museum in quite closely these days. So we find that they are doing a lot of work. It's a very vibrant institution. They are holding workshops. It is not a merely Indian museum. Since I'm connected with them in some way or the other, I get to know about their activities more than the other museums. But the museums in general, their activities have grown enormously in the last few years. They hold workshops, they hands-on learning, outreach programs, exhibitions are always there, public lectures are always there, and several awareness programs. These awareness programs are organized on issues like environmental awareness, conservation, to the vibrant issue of the necessity of the preservation of the rich heritage of our nation. So by organizing different such activities, outreach programs, the museum these days fulfill an extremely important role in ensuring the sustainable development of the nation at large. So these are very important. So where we find they are not secluded from the society, they're always trying to connect with the society, and they're trying to draw many different kinds of people from the society into its precincts and trying to emerge as an institution upholding mass culture. So it is not merely where scholars come and specialists come to carry on their debates, but it also tries to cater to the larger cultural preoccupations of different kinds. Now the question coming to the Indian scenario, since I have named the talk as the Indian perspective, unraveling or exploring the multidimensional museum movement in India, the colonial perspective. So while coming to the question of India, core India, the colonial time, there are different kinds of museums we witness. There are specialized museums, numerous examples are there. I'll just give you a few here. Archaeological museums are there, which is an important category. As we can understand from the nomenclature, archaeological museums, so they assemble archaeological artifacts to tell the story of past societies and civilizations. There are science museums, in the postmodern period, science museums are important. They chart out the manner in which the human civilization, has progressed from primitive conditions to modern time. Railway museums, concept of railway museums are there, which actually talk about the public, before the public, the development of railway system and technologies. We also have the concept of food museum, which traces the evolution of the culinary cultures of different communities. So we have different kinds of museums catering to specified objects. Now, when I was trying to write my thesis, or particularly when I started thinking of writing a book on that, I encountered that the character of museum making in colonial India, in late colonial India, was overwhelmingly archaeological in a sense. So there was a predominance of archaeological museums. Let me give you the name of Harold Hargreaves and Sidney Markham. They had, carried on a kind of a survey of the museums of India in 1936, and I did my work much later than that. But the findings of Harold Hargreaves and Sidney Markham, that the Indian museum world was characterized predominantly by archaeology, that was the same impression I also had when I started working on the history of museums. So now the question is, why was there so much of preoccupation, was so much of predominance of archaeological museum? It is very, we can say that perhaps it was connected with the conservationist policies of the Archaeological Survey. We all know that this was the great age of Indian archaeology under colonial auspices, largely indebted to Lord Curzon, John Marshall, both of whom had an elaborate program of classifying different kinds of archaeological museums in different locations. So we can understand that the role of the ASI in promoting different museums all over India played an instrumental role in popularization of the archaeological museums particularly. We have an enormous list. I will just give you the name of 5 to 10 museums which deal with archaeological objects. Indian museum is not an archaeological museum, it is a multi-purpose museum, because here we have natural history objects, we have archaeological exhibits, ethnological specimens. That is not, we cannot consider it to be an archaeological museum completely. There was the Lahore Museum, undivided India, where archaeological artifacts were predominant. There was a rich collection of Gandhara specimens, objects from diverse fields were also there. Lucknow Museum also had natural history objects, archaeological specimens, economic products, ornithological specimens. Rajputana Museum, Ajmer, I'll talk about this museum just a little later, that had an overt accent on archaeological artifacts, impressive list of images, inscriptions. Then Indore Museum also had the sculptures of Holkar period, Holkars, fragments of ancient monasteries and temples. Sanchi Museum, that belongs to the character where the artifacts from the site was kept, particularly to Sanchi Stupa and from the locality. Sarnath Museum has Brahminical sculptures, apart from a large number of Buddhist sculptures. Antiquities from excavations, there are many such examples. Khajuraho Museum, Nalanda Museum, Peshawar Museum, Mathura Museum, Patna Museum. I'll talk about the Barendra Research Society Museum also from Bengal. So Bengal also witnessed the arrival of some local museums, very important collection with very important collections. I'll talk about that. Why I thought of giving you some names, because I thought this is important for me to give my this audience here to have an understanding of the plethora of museums that came into being in India all over the country. The museums particularly dedicated or particularly focused on keeping archaeological objects were seen almost all over India, and we have a very long list here which is not possible for me to cover here. But my intention was to give you an understanding that India during the colonial period witnessed a full-fledged museum movement. That is why I used very intentionally, I use the term museum movement just in order to give you an understanding that it was not concentrated in one particular area, it was widely spread out all over the country. So these museums that we find coming up during the colonial period, some of these museums were site museums and local museums, and some of them were great museums in the important centers of India. For example, the great museums. If we talk about the great museums, then of course the Indian Museum. We are very blessed that we are living in a city where we have the Indian Museum, the first museum in the entire colony. Tapati Guha Thakurta, the celebrated historian, she had written in her Monuments, Objects, Histories about the Indian Museum. In a chapter, she had written the chapter as the museum in the colony, the first museum in the colony. So it was a museum which was the first museum in the entire subcontinent. And in the official circles, it was always called, designated as the Imperial Museum. So the term Imperial Museum was the common name for the Indian Museum in the official circle. But later on, when the capital of India was transferred from from Calcutta to Delhi, we find that John Marshall was trying to come up with an elaborate plan of establishing an Imperial Museum at New Delhi. That project never came through. I mean, the project of establishing an Imperial Museum at Delhi never came through. But it certainly forms an important backdrop of the formation of the National Museum in Delhi after independence. My approach while I was doing my work, it remained solely focused on trying to answer the question of why different classes of museums were established, why the museum makers were coming up with the question of different museums of different denominations, and what could be the inspirations and imperatives that played in their mind. Why were they coming with so many different kinds of museums? Now the question is, if we have to give you a story or some account of the development of the museums in the colonial period, it will be incomplete if we don't say a few words on the connection that the museums had with nationalism. So as a part of this story, the age of nationalism at the turn of the 18th century, as we all know, created a very different kind of political impulse for which celebration of the nation's greatness and heritage, the search for its ethnic roots, and the place that it began to claim among other nations became inspirations for the museum makers. So we know that, this was a time when different scholars were writing history books. They were trying to draw attention of the common people to the rich heritage and rich history of our country. In Bengal, we have several such, writers who were incidentally also museum makers. So we have important examples from Bengal. They are writing history books. They are also collecting. They're trying to, create the nucleus of small museums. Now the question is, why was this so? What was the incentive? What drove them to write history books? And they were trying to curve the nucleus of museums also, because we can understand that this was a nationalist period when they wanted to make the nation visually tangible, by keeping the artifacts. They wanted to make the nation visually tangible, and so this was an incentive, very important incentive. So there was a conviction that culture constituted the foundation of nationhood, and it was pertinent to trace its roots in the country's history, archaeology, language, tradition. Of late, cultural heritage of India, intangible heritage, this is a very important area of study and scholarly discussion these days. And I happen to teach this section in the post-graduation level, but we can understand that heritage awareness and this kind of an awareness during the nationalist time was very important, very common. And this was a natural development that people wanted to celebrate their nation in a period when the question of their political independence was in a state of jeopardy. So now the question is, nationalism, not only nationalism, we should also talk about regional sentiments. People were also celebrating their regions. So we can say nationalism, then regional sentiments, and then localism. So different kinds of sentimental and emotional fervor were playing important role in evoking this kind of a thought process in common people. Therefore, they are coming up with the question of they are trying to establish museums of different denominations in different localities. I'll give you two examples here where you can connect with the question of regionalism and the love for the place. We know about Gauri Shankar Hirachand Ojha. He was a celebrated historian who chose to write all his books in the language of Hindi in order to reach to the masses. He wrote Rajputana ka Itihas, Solankiyo ka Itihas, and he was not only a writer, a barefoot historian who went about the length and breadth of Rajputana in order to, look. He was trying to find out inscriptions and numismatic evidence and other evidence for celebrating the history of the Rajputs, and gradually he came up with the museum at Rajputana, and which was also designated as the National Museum of Rajputana. So in G.S. Ojha, we find an initiative, an overtly regional sentiment of trying to uphold the early medieval history of the Rajputs by going beyond the modern thrust of celebrating the British and the Mughal connection of the Rajputs. On the other side of the spectrum, we have a similar example coming from Rajshahi in the northern part of Bengal, undivided Bengal. We have the BRSM Museum, Varendra Research Society Museum. It was founded by the local literati. They were also trying to celebrate the history and heritage of their locality, of their region, which they considered to be an ancient center of the Pala rule. We have, apart from these small regional museums, we have the example of several palace museums also. The palace museums were actually when the palaces of the princely families were converted into museums. So I will not go into the detail of palace museums here. But what I would like to emphasize that the museums are not only academic centers. The way we have found in the Greek context and the Egyptian context, that they were houses of muses, shrine of muses, academies of learning. It is quite, we all know that museums have a very important academic function to play, but it is not purely a matter of cultural history. It is also connected with power and its imagination. So it is not accident. It is not an accident that the development of archaeological knowledge and the establishment of museums complemented each other. And as I've already mentioned, that this trend became more pronounced in the age of nationalism. As I told you, that the museums had the power to excite the historical imaginations of the nation. The museums made the nation visually tangible. Now I'll come to the very, very crucial question of what the approach is towards writing museum history. If some of us and some of us, our students, are interested to take on museum as a subject of their study for research, they should know about the different approaches. When we try to write the history of museums, we come across two very major approach. One is known as the internalist approach. What is the internalist approach? This internalist approach is also known as the commemorative approach. I have written in my book about this very, very briefly, though, where we find that, like, a very important example comes from the book Studies in Museums and Museology in India. It was written by a scholar, D.P. Ghosh. It is a kind of a commemorative or internalist approach. It follows the internalist approach because, in internalist approach, what happens? One writes about the development of the individual museums and the galleries of the individual museums. So the internalist histories or the commemorative histories leave us with a fairly accurate impression of the internal development of the individual museums. Now, if we look at the Indian Museum, we will find that there is a book which was published by the trustees of the Indian Museum as a part of the centenary celebration of the museum in 1914. The name of that book was The Indian Museum 1814 to 1914. This was the name of the book written by the trustees of the Indian Museum, published on the occasion of the centenary celebration. Now, it actually contained an elaborate description of the development of the Indian Museum, the way new galleries came up, how the new galleries replaced the old ones, or at the same time, sometimes they coexisted. So this book, the Indian Museum 1814 to 1914, can certainly be designated as an internalist, following the internalist approach. Now, the history contained a reflective account of the museum's first 100 years by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee. He had a contribution. Now, this book was reprinted by the trustees in 2004. As I told you, it gives us an account of the internal development of the galleries, the role of the curators, the role of the superintendents, their individual contribution. Now, apart from these commemorative histories, which we get from the museums, which narrate the history of the museums, there are some catalogs some museum catalogs. When we visit the museums, we always try to get hold of the catalogs which are published by the Department of Culture of Government of India. We know that they also carry brief historical accounts of the institutions. So we, from these catalogs, from these books, from these small booklets, we get some idea. Now, the kind of approach that I think is suitable for a student of history to adopt while trying to undertake a research on the museum history is, of course, the contextualist approach. While I wrote the book on displaying India's heritage, I adopted this contextualist approach by going beyond the internalist approach, because this is a more challenging task. Following contextualist approach is a more challenging task, to put the accounts, the commemorative accounts, in appropriate contextualist framework in order to answer the questions connected with the whys and hows of the making of diverse kinds of museums. I told you that the central question that I had in my mind while I was writing my thesis was the whys and hows. Why it happened, how it happened, why was there a predominance of the archaeological museum, what was the imperative that played an instrumental role behind in the mind of the museum functionaries while they were writing. So a few questions which I tried to address: why did archaeology become so much of a major preoccupation in the museum movement in India in the period of high nationalism? Then the question: why was cultural heritage defined largely from historical and archaeological perspective influenced Indian museum movement in colonial India? So these questions, when I raised these questions in my mind and tried to find answers of this question, it helped me establish the connection between the museum movement and the broader political and the cultural environment of the time. In the Indian context, at the turn of the 20th century, the very well discussed contest between imperialism and nationalism, that also remained one of the defining elements in the history of museum. So I think, in my opinion, if someone asks me, I will adopt a contextualist approach to understand the development of historical and archaeological museums in India during the colonial time. Again, I'll give you two examples. In order to understand this contestation between imperialism and nationalism in the Indian context, if we look at again the Indian Museum, the example of the Indian Museum, this point will become clear. There are strong grounds for arguing that the Indian Museum in Calcutta, that started its life as the Asiatic Society collection, we know that in the 19th century, carried with it imprints of the Orientalist curiosity of the British officials in India. The imperial ideology that projected India as an exotic and unchanging land of antiquity was in all likelihood a strong inspiration in the minds of those who created the Indian Museum. This point is already known to us by way of several lectures. We know that why was the Indian Museum created, why did the Indian Museum receive so much of importance in the official circle, why was it considered to be the imperial museum, what was the objective, why was there a preponderance of, there was in the initial days when it was in the Asiatic Society, why was there an overt emphasis placed on natural history, and why was there a shift again from natural history to archaeology? We can certainly connect it with the changing preoccupations of the Orientalist British officials in India. The imperial ideology did not remain static, it continuously changed. So with the changing imperial ideologies, there was a change in the designing and display of the Indian Museum, though I won't go into the discussion of Indian Museum into this lecture. Now, if we consider the other very illustrious example from Calcutta itself, the Victoria Memorial Hall, we have a completely different kind of an imperial vision. We know that the imperial intention was palpably clear when we find that it was planned by Lord Curzon in the high noon of the British Empire in India. Its imposing buildings, its collection, the painting galleries, the sculptures of the officials, this tried to celebrate the triumph of British power in India. So can we then, if we keep all these examples in mind, we can understand that museums cannot be seen merely as an institution of public education from the vantage point of museum making. To see museums, therefore, merely as temples of learning is to ignore the symbiotic relationship between museums and the modern public sphere. So another important feature of this connection was the nationalization of collection and sites. I'll give you an example here. When that happened, they emerged as a part of national legacy, providing sustenance to attempts to define the cultural foundations of nationhood. Before I give you the example, I will try to talk about the Patna Museum. The Patna Museum provides us with a very, very interesting example of the contest between two museums, that is the India Museum and the Patna Museum, which is a regional museum, which is a new museum. You know, the Patna Museum was established in 1916 after, you know, it also synchronized with the creation of the province of Bihar and Odisha, and the Journal of the Bihar Odisha Research Society, which we refer always, that also celebrated Bihar's freedom from the classes of Bengal, control of Bengal. So the Patna Museum, which was a later museum, much, much later museum than the Indian Museum, the functionaries of the Patna Museum, Justice Bucknell, he resented the fact that before the Patna Museum was established, most of the important artifacts had been taken to the Indian Museum. So when the Patna Museum had been established, there was a continuous effort by the functionaries of the high functionaries of the Patna Museum to reclaim the artifacts from the Indian Museum. And as we can predictably, there was a tussle, there was a conflict, there was a contestation. The Indian Museum at that time, RP Chandu was there. RP Chandu, Ramaprasad Chandu, he was not willing to part with the artifacts that had been taken from the Patna Museum to the Indian Museum, and he was ready to spare some of the artifacts, you know, some of the plaster casts. He was not going to give Patna Museum the original share. So these kind of custodial conflicts also play an enormously important role, you know, in the museum movement, museum history of museum making. And the interesting evidence that we come from the files of the Archaeological Survey about the dispute between the Indian Museum and the Patna Museum certainly constitutes an important factor of museum movement in India. Now I'll come to the question of the journey of an artifact. I was telling you that how does an artifact become a national relic or a very important historical relic? How do we find that artifact? How does it go to the museum? So this also relates to an important question of historiography of the museums. I'll give you an example of from Tapati Guha Thakurta, the Yakshi figure that is now kept in the Patna Museum, the Didarganj Yakshi figure. How was it discovered? How did it go to the Patna Museum? This also involves an important question of the history of museums. So the journey of an object is an important fact of museum history. Related to the question of the custodial disputes that I was talking about is the relic, the way the relic becomes an object in the museum, acquiring a certain symbolism in cultural history. In an equally fascinating discussion on the Yakshi figure from Didarganj, Tapati Guhu Thakurta showed us, among other things, how objects have their distinct histories. The figure, you know, the Yakshi figure was discovered by a Maulavi near the Pataliputra site. Ultimately, it found its way into the Patna Museum. And when it was there in the field, discovered by a Maulavi, it was worshipped by the local people as a god, as a goddess. And then it finally went to the museum. After it went to the museum, we understand it came under the gaze of the experts. It emerged as a fine example of Mauryan art. So, one thing I wanted to emphasize in today's lecture, that a private collection, a palace collection, a chitrashala or a painting gallery cannot be considered as a museum unless and until it is open to the public. So the public dimension lends it the character of a museum. That is very important to keep in our mind. So for any collection to grow into a museum, the interface with the public is inescapable. We cannot deny the fact. With the intrusion of the ideological concerns of the public sphere in the making of museum, the collection emerges as a part of the multidimensional museum movement as equally potent sites of political contest. So the multidimensional museum movement is what I kept in my title. And I try to emphasize that how public dimension, how the changing ideological prerogatives of the nation that leave an important impact on the functionaries of the museums. For the same reason, studying the history of museums in a country like India that require an understanding of the varied ideological dimensions of museumizations. Each museum tries to tell a story, and it is possible that with the changing times, their the ideas governing their exhibitions policies also change, leading to rearrangement of galleries. A study of how new concerns and preoccupations determined changing modes of display using new artifacts is necessary to reconstruct the shifting ideological imperatives behind the development of museums. So, the shifting ideological imperatives is a very, very important question for us to understand. I have already given many lectures on the way the entire exhibition policies of the Indian Museum changed over time, how it had a different look under Cunningham, how the look changed during the nationalist time under Roychowdhury. So, if we try to understand, if we try to engage with the history of museums, we have to keep in mind the way the new preoccupations, new concerns, they reflect in the changing display, changing modes of display and artifacts. So we have to keep into mind the shifting ideological imperatives behind the development of museums. Thank you all. Here I end. Thank you.
থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাডাম। প্রথমেই যখন আমাদের আলোচনা হচ্ছিল, আমার সেই পুরনো মাস্টার ডিগ্রি স্মৃতিটাই বেশি ভেসে আসছিল, যে ক্লাসে আমরা যেভাবে শুনতাম সেইগুলোই মনে পড়তো বেশি, যে ম্যাডাম আমাদের যেরকম ভাবে বোঝাতেন, আমাদের টিচাররা তো অনেকটা আমাদের বন্ধুর মতো করে মিশে আমাদের সবকিছু বোঝাতেন, কোনো প্রবলেম হলে সেগুলো বলতেন, সেইগুলোই বেশি মনে পড়ছিল আমার। থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাডাম, অনেক ধন্যবাদ আপনাকে একটু ভালো সময় আমাদের দেওয়ার জন্য। এবার আমি একটু প্রশ্ন অ্যান্সার সেশনে আসি। আমাদের যদি কেউ প্রশ্ন করতে চাও নিজে কমেন্ট বক্সে জানাতে পারো। তার আগে আমি একটা প্রশ্ন করতে চাই ম্যাডাম। ম্যাডাম বলবো আমি?
হ্যাঁ, নিশ্চয়ই নিশ্চয়ই, অবশ্যই।
হ্যাঁ ম্যাডাম, আমি একটা জিনিস বলছি যে বারবার ক্ষেত্রে আপনি যেটা মেনশন করলেন যে পাবলিক অ্যাওয়ারনেসটা খুব দরকার। পাবলিক অ্যাওয়ারনেসের থ্রু দিয়ে কিন্তু আমরা অনেক কিছু এগোতে পারি। আপনি যদি একটু গ্রামে গঞ্জের দিকে যান, পুরুলিয়া, বাঁকুড়া বা বর্ধমানে, সেখানে কিন্তু বিভিন্ন সময় বিভিন্ন আর্টিফ্যাক্ট ডিসকভার হয়, এবং যেটা আপনি বললেন যে ক্লেমটা কে করবে, সেই ক্লেম নিয়ে কিন্তু বড় ঝামেলা লেগে, এবং ওখানকার স্থানীয় পাবলিক কিছুতেই সেই মূর্তিটাকে দিতে চায় না, এবং তাদের মতো করে মূর্তিটা পুজো করতে আরম্ভ করে। আমরাও যখন পুরুলিয়া ভিজিট করেছিলাম আরেকজনের সঙ্গে, অনন্তচন্দ্র, ওকেও সঙ্গে যখন ভিজিট করেছিলাম, তখনও কিন্তু আমরা এটা দেখলাম যে স্থানীয় একটা জৈন মূর্তি, সম্ভবত নেমিনাথের মূর্তি ছিল ওটা, ওটা করার পর ওরা কিন্তু ক্ষেত্রপাল ঠাকুর হিসেবেই দীর্ঘদিন পুজো করে যাচ্ছে। আরো পাশে একটা শান্তিনাথের মূর্তি ওটা হয়েছে, কিন্তু আলটিমেট ব্যাপারটা কি হয়, কিছুদিন পরেই মূর্তিটা চুরি হয়ে, এবং দুর্ভাগ্যবশত আমাদের ঐতিহাসিকের থেকে বেশি কিছু চোরাচালানকারী বেশি ইতিহাস সংক্রান্ত খবর রাখে। এটা খুব দুর্ভাগ্য। এবং এই কিছুদিন আগেই, ৩-৪ মাস আগেই, মহাস্থানগড় বা আমাদের ওই দিকটা, নদীর ওই দিকটা, একজন ব্যবসায়ী প্রায় 2 ঘর আর্টিফ্যাক্ট নিয়ে বসেছে। সে নিজে গবেষণা করে এগুলোকে জোগাড় করতো, মাটি খুঁড়ে রাত্রে নিয়ে আসতো, এবং পরের দিন সকালে গিয়ে বিক্রি করতো ইন্টারন্যাশনাল। তো এই এত পাবলিক অ্যাওয়ারনেস এত খারাপের জন্য কিন্তু আপনার মনে হয় যে অনেক আমাদের ইন্ডিয়ান আর্টিফ্যাক্ট প্রচুর হারিয়ে যাচ্ছে?
অবশ্যই, এটা তো ভীষণ বড় সমস্যা। এটা একটা মিউজিয়াম ইতিহাসের হেরিটেজের, আমরা যে হেরিটেজের অ্যাওয়ারনেস প্রতিটা জায়গায় আমরা হেরিটেজ যোগাচ্ছি অ্যাজ পার্ট অফ দ্য সিলেবাস। কেন বলতো? কেননা আমরা এটাকে রুখতে পারছি না, এটাকে স্টপ করা খুব ডিফিকাল্ট। ইটস রিয়েলি ডিফিকাল্ট। মানে তুমি যেটা বলছো এটা খুব কমন অ্যাফেয়ার, যেটা আমরা চেষ্টা করি বন্ধ করবার জন্য, কারণ নইলে তো আমাদের হেরিটেজ নষ্ট হয়ে যাবে, আমরা আমাদের অত্যন্ত গুরুত্বপূর্ণ ইতিহাস হারিয়ে ফেলব। এবং যে জন্যই এই অ্যাওয়ারনেস ক্রিয়েট করা দরকার, আমরা চেষ্টা করছি, গভর্নমেন্ট চেষ্টা করছে, আমরা সবাই চেষ্টা করছি নানাভাবে। কোনো একটা প্রশ্ন আছে মনে হয় কারোর। Okay, thank you. Doipayon has asked a question. Since when did museum begin to depict intangible heritage? And regional needs have worked to highlight the intangible heritage. So this question cannot be answered with any certain. I don't have any certain answer to your question, Doipayon, because I myself don't know exactly from what time. It is true that of late, in the last 20 years or so, We are talking about these two branches, tangible and intangible heritage, where these two jargons, these two terms are getting wide discussion and currency these days. But since when the museum started exhibiting intangible heritage is a difficult question to answer. I don't know exactly. And regional sentiments, of course, played an important role in the popularization of the local and the regional museums, as I was trying to illustrate with regard to the colonial perspective. I've given you some examples to help you understand that how regionalism has an integral feature, is an indelible element of museum making. But the question is, you have talked about intangible heritage. Intangible heritage is, of course, an idea that is gaining momentum these days, and the museums are trying to, conduct various workshops and various performances and other things by way of this holding such uh, affairs. They're trying to popularize the concept of intangible heritage, but I'm not sure exactly when the thing came into being. Exactly when, I'm not exactly aware of the date.
থ্যাংক ইউ। একজন আমাদের প্রশ্ন করেছে যে ভারতের মিউজিয়াম আন্দোলন কি শুধু ব্রিটিশরাই ছিল না অন্য কোনো বিদেশিও ছিল? আমার মনে হয় প্রশ্ন করতে চাইছে যে ভারতের যে মিউজিয়াম যে হেরিটেজে সেখানে ব্রিটিশ বা ইন্ডিয়ান পার্টিসিপেট করছিল না অন্যান্য যারা ছিল ড্যানিশ বা পর্তুগিজ এরাও কিছু রোল নিচ্ছিল, সেই মনে হয় বলতে চাইছে।
অর্পিতা চক্রবর্তী প্রশ্ন করেছে। না, এটা ভালো প্রশ্ন করেছে, মানে কারণ দেখো, যখন আমরা ইন্ডিয়ান মিউজিয়াম দেখতে পাই, যখন এশিয়াটিক সোসাইটি থেকে যখন আমরা ইন্ডিয়ান মিউজিয়ামে, আমরা আগেই বলেছি যে এশিয়াটিক সোসাইটি কনস্টিটিউটেড দ্য নিউক্লিয়াস অফ দ্য ইন্ডিয়ান মিউজিয়াম, অ্যান্ড ন্যাথানিয়েল ওয়ালিচ হিমসেলফ ওয়াজ আ ডেনিশ বটানিস্ট. He was a Danish. So there is not, yes, of course, the British, since we were in a colony and under the British colonialism, we were there, but the role of other Europeans were certainly there, because Nathaniel Wallich was himself a Danish. And if we look at the first few generations of museum makers in the Indian Museum, there were foreigners, there were Europeans who belonged to other provinces, not only England. John McClelland, Edward Blyth, exactly. There are some people who were not British by birth. They belong to other provinces of Europe. So there were other officials also.
আচ্ছা, আমাদের আরেকজনও প্রশ্ন করেছে প্রাইভেট যারা মিউজিয়াম করছে তাদের কতটা রোল থাকবে, মানে প্রাইভেট যারা সংগ্রহশালা তাদের কথাটা আমার মনে বলছি।
দেখো, ও যে কোন পিরিয়ডটা নিয়ে বলছে এটা তো ক্লিয়ার না, মানে যে কোয়েল রয় যেটা প্রশ্ন করেছে এক্স্যাক্টলি ও পিরিয়ডটা আমি জানি না। তবে এটা বলবো আমি ওকে, নিশ্চয়ই আমি এটা বলবো যে প্রাইভেটলি যারা মিউজিয়াম তৈরি করে, যারা ব্যক্তিগত উদ্যোগে মিউজিয়াম তৈরি করে, সেরকম তারা গভর্নমেন্টাল সাপোর্ট পায় না। অ্যাটলিস্ট আমি যে পিরিয়ডটা নিয়ে কাজ করেছি সেই পিরিয়ডে আমাদের কাছে এরকম অনেক এক্সাম্পল আছে। যেমন ধরো একটা এক্সাম্পল কথা তোমাদের আমি বলি, যোগেন্দ্রনাথ গুপ্ত, তিনি একজন বড় ঐতিহাসিকও বটে, এবং তিনি বিক্রমপুরের ইতিহাস লিখছেন। তিনি বিক্রমপুর জেলাতে একটা ছোট সংগ্রহশালা করেছিলেন, যেটা কিন্তু ব্যক্তিগত উদ্যোগে তৈরি করা, হ্যাঁ, কিন্তু সেটার গুরুত্ব এবং সেখানে যে আর্টিফ্যাক্টস গুলো তিনি এবং লোকাল লিটারেরি সোসাইটি, আমি যেটা তোমাদের বলার চেষ্টা করছিলাম, যখন আমি বারেন্দ্র রিসার্চ সোসাইটি বলেছি, দেয়ার আর আদার লিটারেরি সোসাইটিস, দেয়ার আর আদার প্রাইভেট ইনিশিয়েটিভস, হ্যাঁ, যেটা প্রশ্নটা করেছে, ইম্পর্টেন্ট ভালো প্রশ্ন করেছে, যে যারা এই প্রাইভেট ইনিশিয়েটিভস, তাদের কি কোনো ভূমিকা নেই? তাদের বিশাল ভূমিকা আছে, কারণ তারা গভর্নমেন্টাল সাপোর্ট পাচ্ছে না, তারা সেভাবে কোনো ইন্ডিয়ান মিউজিয়ামের মতো একটা বড় মিউজিয়াম না যারা প্রচুর গ্রান্ট পাচ্ছে। মানে আমি বলতে চাইছি, কলোনিয়াল পিরিয়ডেও তো ইন্ডিয়ান মিউজিয়াম একটা ফেভারেবল অবস্থায় ছিল, কিন্তু তার পাশাপাশি যখন আমরা এই ধরনের ছোট ছোট সংগ্রহশালা দেখছি, সেই সংগ্রহশালাগুলো তাদের মতো করে একটা সচেতনতা সৃষ্টি করতে একটা অত্যন্ত গুরুত্বপূর্ণ ভূমিকা পালন করছে। যেমন যোগেন গুপ্তের যে বিক্রমপুর জেলার ইতিহাসও তিনি লিখছেন, অ্যাজ ওয়েল অ্যাজ তিনি মিউজিয়ামও সৃষ্টি করছেন, এবং প্রচন্ড হার্ডশিপের মধ্যে এই মিউজিয়ামগুলো চলতো, কিন্তু তাদের একটা সেই লোকাল অ্যাওয়ারনেস বা রিজিয়নাল একটা হিস্ট্রি সম্পর্কে তাদেরকে সাধারণ মানুষকে জ্ঞাত করা, তাদেরকে ফ্যামিলিয়ারাইজ করা, সেই রোলটা তারা প্লে করতো। অতএব আমি বলবো উত্তর হিসেবে যে প্রাইভেট মিউজিয়ামের রোল তো নিশ্চিতভাবে অনেকখানি, তাদেরও অনেকখানি রোল।
থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাডাম। আরেকজন আমাদের বলছে ক্যান ইউ এক্সপ্লেন মি উইদাউট আ স্পেশাল অ্যাবাউট দ্য লুভার মিউজিয়াম? আমার এটা ইন জেনারেল কোশ্চেন, এটা যে
This
কোনো
is a very
বইতেও
general
পেয়ে
question.
যাবেন।
Yes, of course. This is Pritam Chakraborty.
স্টুডেন্ট।
This is a very, very
তো
general
এই
question, Pritam. I'm sorry, it's difficult. Louvre is such a how much আচ্ছা ওটা অন্য অন্য প্রশ্নে চলে গেল এটা। লুভার মিউজিয়ামে লুভার একটা বিরাট বড় মিউজিয়াম, তার একটা বিরাট আলোচনা। হ্যাঁ, সেটা আমি কেন আজকে বলেছি, তোমাদের যদি মনে হয় ম্যাম ইন্ডিয়ার তিনি একটা পার্সপেক্টিভ ইন্ডিয়ান পার্সপেক্টিভে লিখেছেন, কিন্তু তিনি কেন বললেন ব্রিটিশ মিউজিয়াম বা লুভ মিউজিয়াম, এটা এই কারণে বলেছি যে এটা একসময় রেস্ট্রিক্টেড এন্ট্রি ছিল, পরে এটা ওপেন এন্ট্রি হয়ে যায়। ওপেন এন্ট্রিটা একটা পলিটিক্যাল রিজন ছিল, একটা কম্পালশন ছিল। দেয়ার ওয়াজ আ পলিটিক্যাল কম্পালশন ফর দ্য মিউজিয়াম to convert its character from a restricted character to an open character. So that's why I brought about the question of Louvre Museum or British Museum. But I'm sorry, this is a very, this question requires a lot of explanation on my part, which is difficult for me to do now. How such accurate is the change, how much accurate is to change the vision of museum as we can see today, the budget of the journal is being changed every very from the Imperial Vision to National Museum. It has already been addressed by me in my lecture, Pritam Radhuka, because I have categorically emphasized this question of how the perspectives change, how the ideological preoccupations changed, the varied ideological preoccupations, how do they influence the museum making. So we cannot expect a museum to have a fixed character, but this question is not very true also. I mean, it's now emerging as a national museum. It is too much to say that, but the essential character was that of an imperial museum, and there might be changes according to the changing the varied ideological perspectives. This point has been discussed.
আমাদের তো ম্যাডাম অদিতি সেনগুপ্ত, ম্যাডাম আপনি কোনো কিছু বলবেন?
হ্যাঁ, খুব সুন্দর লেকচার। আমার সাবজেক্ট ইংলিশ লিটারেচার, বাট বিকজ আই রিসেন্টলি ভিজিটেড সো মেনি মিউজিয়ামস, একটা কথা কোয়েশ্চেন ঠিক না, কমেন্ট বলতে পারি, যেটা বললেন প্রাইভেট মিউজিয়ামের এই যে স্ট্রাগল ফর ফান্ডস, এটা আমরা দেখে এলাম ভীষণভাবে আচার্য জগদীশ চন্দ্র বোসের বাড়িতে, যিনি মানে চার্জে আছেন, দ্য প্রেসিডেন্ট অফ দ্য ট্রাস্টি বোর্ড। তিনি খুব আক্ষেপ করলেন যে বিবেকানন্দর অ্যানসেস্ট্রাল হাউসের কত ফান্ডস, জোড়াসাঁকোর জন্য কত ফান্ডস, বাট তাদের কথাটা খুব একটা লোকে জানেও না, এবং দে আর ভেরি ডায়ার স্ট্রেটস ফর ফান্ডস। আর সেরকমভাবে পাবলিসিটিও নেই। আমি অনেক খুঁজে পেতে বের করেছিলাম যে সামথিং ডিফারেন্ট ফর আওয়ার স্টুডেন্টস। তবে যে জিনিসটা আমার খুব ভালো লাগছে, যেটা হচ্ছে মানে আমরা যখন বড় হয়েছি কলকাতায়, তখন একটি মিউজিয়াম ছিল, ইন্ডিয়ান মিউজিয়াম। এখন দেখছি যে ছোট ছোট মিউজিয়াম হচ্ছে, ট্রামের মিউজিয়াম, রেলওয়ে মিউজিয়াম, তারপরে আমরা আরবিআই মিউজিয়ামে আমাদের স্টুডেন্টদের নিয়ে গিয়েছিলাম, আর জেল মিউজিয়াম হয়েছে আলিপুর। মানে এই জিনিসটা মানে টু ফোকাস অন স্পেসিফিক থিংস, এই জিনিসটা আমার মনে হয় ভেরি ইন্টারেস্টিং।
It's very interesting.
ট্রাম তো উঠেই যাচ্ছে, অ্যাটলিস্ট ট্রাম মিউজিয়ামটা থাকলে একটু ট্রামেও চড়তে পারছে যারা পরবর্তী জেনারেশনস, অ্যান্ড অলসো দে গেট অ্যান আইডিয়া অফ দ্য হিস্ট্রি অফ দ্য ট্রাম অ্যান্ড দ্য হিস্ট্রি অফ দ্য সিটি অ্যাজ ওয়েল।
Of course.
খুব ভালো লাগলো ম্যাডাম, আমার স্টুডেন্টরা নিশ্চয়ই উপকারিত হয়েছে হিস্ট্রি ডিপার্টমেন্টের। যাই হোক, কৌশিকেরই
This is a
উদ্যোগে
very good observation, ma'am, Dr. Sengupta, because আমরা সত্যি অনেক কিছু জানি না। যেটা আপনি বললেন আচার্য জগদীশ চন্দ্র বোস, আমরা অলওয়েজ কিছু কিছু মিউজিয়ামে যেতাম আমাদের ছেলেবেলায়, কিন্তু এটা সত্যি যে এখন কিন্তু অ্যাওয়ারনেসটা আগের থেকে বেড়েছে। হ্যাঁ, কিন্তু আমি যাইনি, নিজেও কখনো ভিজিট করিনি, দেখি যদি পারি যাব। কারণ তখন খুব কষ্ট লাগে যে মিউজিয়ামের এত পসিবিলিটি আছে, এত ভালো ভালো তার আর্টিফ্যাক্টস আছে, সেগুলো দে আর অ্যাকচুয়ালি সাফারিং ফর ল্যাক অফ ফান্ড। আর আমার খুব মনে হয় জানেন যে আমাদের এই এডুকেশন সিস্টেম, যেটা আমার খুব প্রায় মনে হয় যে আমরা যখন বাইরে গেছি পড়াশোনা করতে বা কোথাও, এত মিউজিয়ামের ওখানে স্টুডেন্টদের প্রত্যেক সময়, ইচ অ্যান্ড এভরি ডে স্টুডেন্টস আর গোয়িং টু দ্য মিউজিয়ামস, দে আর লার্নিং ফ্রম ইট। দ্য So, I mean, এই যে stereotyped education system, if it could come out of that, and সেটা হয়তো খুব ভালো হতো, কিন্তু জানি না, তাও এখন অনেক চেঞ্জ হয়েছে, সেটাই আসার কথা।
যেটা দরকার কি জানেন তো, যত বেশি এরা দেখবে পাস্ট আর্টিফ্যাক্ট গুলো সামনে, মানে নেক্সট জেনারেশনের মধ্যে সেই অ্যাওয়ারনেসটা আসবে দ্যাট উই হ্যাভ টু রেসপেক্ট আওয়ার পাস্ট। ওই যে এখানে মন্দির মসজিদ যেগুলো আছে, কিভাবে তাহলে ডিসেক্রেট করে রাখে, মানে
হ্যাঁ,
যে
একেবারে।
সব মানে জিনিস তো আর সব আর্কিওলজিক্যাল সাইটও তো প্রোটেক্ট করে এএসআই এর পক্ষে রাখা সম্ভব নয়। ছোটখাটো
একদম।
গ্রামে মন্দির আছে, কিভাবে নষ্ট হচ্ছে, লোকে ভেঙে নিয়ে চলে যাচ্ছে। মানে দিস অ্যাওয়ারনেস হ্যাজ টু গ্রো ফ্রম দ্য স্কুল লেভেল,
This awareness
যে
has to
এটা
be-
আমার
একেবারে।
দেশের প্রপার্টি, এটা আমাকে রাখতে হবে, আমি এটা
আমাকে
ডিস্ট্রয়
রাখতে
করবো
হবে।
না। এই সেন্সটা মিউজিয়াম গুলো ডেফিনেটলি হেল্প করছে।
থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাডাম। আমি এটা নিয়ে আরেকটা বলি যে আগের বছর আমরা সুইসা গ্রামে গিয়েছিলাম পুরুলিয়া, সেখানে এএসআই এর একটা মিউজিয়াম আছে, একতলার একটা মিউজিয়াম। সেখানে মোটামুটি 8 থেকে 10টা জৈন মূর্তি এবং তার যে শাসন দেবীরা আছে পুরো ভাঙাচোরা অবস্থায়, কেউ কোথাও নেই। কেউ অনেক গ্রামে দুটো বাড়ি ঘুরে একটা ছেলেকে জোগাড় করা গেল, 6 বছরের ছেলে, সে একটা চাবি দিয়ে একটা খুললো। মানে এত দামি জিনিস এত ওপেনলি পড়ে আছে, মানে যে কোনো দিন চুরি হয়ে যেত। সুইসা গ্রামে, সুইসা আর্কিওলজিক্যাল সাইনবোর্ড দিয়ে মিউজিয়ামটা। তো এই অ্যাওয়ারনেস আমাদের আরো দরকার, হয়তো আমাদের এই চোরাচালান থেকে অনেক রক্ষা করতে পারে। কারণ পুরুলিয়া, বাঁকুড়া বা আমাদের এখন নদিয়া, 24 পরগনায় মানে চোরাচালানের স্বর্ণভূমি, বারবার এখান থেকে হয়েছে এবং এটা কনসাসনেসের অভাবে। থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাডাম, আপনারা অনেক ভালো সময়ের জন্য, এবং আমরা আশা করব আমাদের পরবর্তী প্রোগ্রামে আপনি আমাদের কলেজে আসুন।
নিশ্চয়ই নিশ্চয়ই, তোমাদেরও অনেক ধন্যবাদ, তোমরা আমায় সুযোগ দিয়েছো একটু বলার। আমি সেরকম যতটুকু জানি আমি সে ততটুকু শেয়ার করেছি, আর একটা দিক শেয়ার করেছি।
থ্যাংক
আমি
ইউ
জানি
ম্যাডাম।
না যারা শুনেছে তারা উপকৃত হয়েছে কিনা। অনেক ধন্যবাদ তোমাকে আর ডক্টর সেনগুপ্তকে।
তো ম্যাডাম আমরা এবার প্রোগ্রাম, থ্যাংক ইউ।
ঠিক আছে।